All right. Next, we have Ty, who's a co-founder of the mental health tech company 8-Bit Cortex, where he focuses on gamifying mental health assessment.
All right, thank you very much, Eden. And guys, shall I be able to see my screen now? So thank you very much for having me present this evening. So when I was originally approached this, I was kind of tasked with the question of thinking about, an expanded definition of what neurotechnology could include. So what I want to go through in the 15 minutes that I have allotted to me is to talk about the various professional experience that I've had kind of leading up until my current experience with 8-Bit Cortex, and kind of thinking about how each of these different iterations really change my understanding of what neurotechnology is and can be, and potentially get you guys all thinking about where it could be moving into the future. So I actually did my undergraduate degree at the University of Alberta with Dr. Clayton Dixon in the Brain Rhythms Lab. And this was my first introduction to neurotechnologies. We would probably recognize it today using EEG recordings in rats. We were looking at local field potentials to see how different molecular biology interventions and manipulations could impact this activity. And there's a couple citations here from the publications that came from that work. And the TLDR for this line of work is that if you mess up the underlying molecular biology of neurons, you prevent neurons from being able to fire and communicate, and this messes up behavior. Surprise, who would not have guessed that? But you had to do a study in order to do that. And when I was in this lab, my understanding of neurotechnology is really that it had to be pharmaceutical in nature. It was in many ways restricted to molecular biology-based interventions, where you would have to go through the drug development process in order to really commercialize any sort of understanding of basic science research. And that was really just a limitation of where a lot of the technology was at the time. But then I started working with a branch of Neurological Foundation, and they fund what they call a NeuroCAM research, which is looking into the neuroscience of a complementary alternative modalities. And this really expanded my idea of thinking about what neurotechnology potentially could include. For just one example, over the last 10 to 15 years, we've really come to appreciate the interchange between the microbiome and our gastrointestinal tract and how that impacts our brain functioning. Um, and within the last several years, there's actually been a few different startup companies looking at how they could do assays for this and how it could potentially relate to your overall health. So this really starts getting you to think about how that approach is considered neurotechnology, but traditional nutrition advising is not. And thinking about kind of the expanded role that technology can play in offering various healthcare services in a broadened array, really getting creative with how we define neurotechnology. So that's just one example, in addition to some of the more traditional forms of neurotechnology they're probably more familiar with, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, as well as BCI technology. So this is kind of where I was at leading into grad school, and I wanted to pursue my PhD in finding a way to apply neurotechnology towards clinical problems. So for that, I went to the University of Utah because it turns out that people that are looking at the role of EEG within psychological assessment are very few and far between. And I was fortunate enough to get accepted into a clinical psychology program in Utah. And specifically, I was learning how to become a clinical neuropsychologist, meaning that I was taking data from many different sources and trying to integrate it together and trying to give a much more clear picture of what might be happening with someone's brain and some of the consequences that would have for their overall functioning. So on the left is a traditional research grade EEG that I was working with in my research at the time. And then this middle panel is the MoCA, which is a very common cognitive assessment that's often used clinically. And I was surprised by the amount of pushback that there often was within the clinical community for the adoption of neurotechnology. For me, it seemed like such a no-brainer. It's like, yeah, you just strap a cap on and you record some brain waves while people are doing some sort of cognitive task. And they've got this, an actual biomarker that could complement the cognitive information that you could get from the more traditional cognitive assessments. But I was really surprised about the pushback. But I also had another experience while I was in Utah, where I got involved with a group that was actually looking at brain activity within natural environments. Put it quite briefly, we literally took people on a camping trip and looked at how their brainwaves changed in natural environments, in this case, the Utah desert, relative to urban environments. So you can see in the picture there is from when I was actually a participant in that study before I got involved in helping out on the research end of it. And this was my first experience in really taking neurotechnology outside of the lab and appreciating that we can use it fairly reliably in these non-standardized contexts that a lot of people might assume that EEG recordings have to happen within. So, and then this led towards one of the papers that I published over the course of my PhD that really got me thinking about how we could be much more creative about the data that we're collecting. So one of my biggest frustrations when people were looking at the use of EEG as a biomarker is that it was always looking at just the mean or the average, whereas there's much more information we could potentially be pulling from. So in this paper, I was basically arguing that we could use patterns in time across data as a much more sensitive way to try to acquire this information. And the specific focus that I took for this paper was actually looking at smartphone technology. So looking at the fact that we all have these smartphones in our pocket that we're able to interact with apps and stuff like that. And think about how we can more creatively use that data towards understanding someone's overall psychological wellness. So I'm not going to get into any of the math that's on the slide. This is just a bit of a proof of concept. But this paper actually ended up being very foundational because it ended up leading towards 8-bit Cortex. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, myself and the other early members of 8-bit Cortex, we realized that while the world's really focused on this, on the virus, that there's going to be much more long-term consequences happening as a result of the economic fallout and the consequences of the social isolation measures. And 8-bit Cortex really wanted to address this. So we surveyed a number of our potential customers, people, young Canadians, and we found that over 50% of them were struggling with at least one different kind of a mental health challenge, oftentimes multiple. Really speaking to the gravity of the situation. And this was only several months into the pandemic. I can only imagine how these numbers are going to look as we continue to hit the 1-year anniversary of the lockdowns. But what I think was perhaps more shocking, oh, there's a line. Sorry, what I think was perhaps more shocking is we also found that 37% of our target customers reported wanting to see a therapist, but not being able to do so, either as a result of long wait times or cost being a barrier to entry. So this really highlighted the role that we needed some alternative way for delivering these services. And being millennials, we're very faithful in technology as being able to solve these problems. And there are, in fact, a number of mental health apps out there available on the market. But we found that a lot of people expressed that these were either too boring, they took up too much time, or again, reiterating that cost barrier as reasons why they weren't necessarily feasible or moving forward. So this is where 8-bit Cortex really tried to put things on its head, and using this new expanded understanding of what neurotechnology could be, is to try to develop a solution to this. And we settled on gamifying the psychological assessment process. So really harmonizing a lot of the professional experiences that I'd had up until that point into this one set of services that we could provide. And the line's still there. Oh well, moving on. So right now I'm going to give you guys a quick demo of right now a prototype that we're making for trying to gamify the psychological assessment process. So you would start off by logging into our app and selecting some recent experiences and activities that you've done. Based on the scientific literature, we know that these can all have some degree of impact on your brain functioning. So this gives us a context for which the data that we're going to be collecting happens within. Then people will be invited to give some self-reports on various emotions that they might be experiencing. Again, consistent with a lot of the current approaches to tracking mental health clinically. And then what I think is probably our novel innovation is we then invite people to play this micro game. So here they're dodging those obstacles and trying to collect those power-ups. And we're able to log their reaction times, really tapping into a long history of chronometric cognitive tasks as a way to make inferences about people's attention, and how that might fluctuate across time due to those lifestyle factors I previously mentioned that we're measuring. And then afterwards, people are treated to a wellness tip that is collected in order to give people some sort of personalized information based on their unique psychological needs. And the goal of all this is then people use this app multiple times over a period of time. So, say once a day for a couple weeks. And we would be able to take that analytic approach that I previously mentioned, that time series analysis, and we could get much more insightful information about how people's mental health is operating on a day to day basis. So, being able to look at not just their average, but also the consistency, whether or not there's a relationship between things like mindfulness and exercise and diet and sleep habits, and how that impacts people's cognition and their overall mental well being. So I think I'll finish up a couple minutes early, but I wanted to give a quick shout out. So some of you may have noticed the exciting art in the background. So this was actually inspired by some research that was done at the University of Alberta, looking at the effects of hyperoxygenated air on resting state brain activity. So I thought this group in particular might appreciate this tie-in. So this painting is going to be featured as part of your Brain on Art, a virtual online art exhibition and auction on March 11th. And then there's the information there for the artist who created it, as well as my own personal social media handles and email address. So at that point, I believe we have just over a minute for some questions, if anyone has those.
While they're coming into the chat, Ty, I'm just wondering how long it's taking you to sort of get 8-bit Cortex up and running.
That really depends on how you define like the start and the up and running stage. So when it comes to just like having these ideas, I've actually had them for a number of years now, but they've just kind of lived as ideas in my head that I wasn't able to execute. It really wasn't until probably March or so that the ideas actually became formatted into a business plan that, had some sort of tractable reality. And then it wasn't until the end of summer 2020 that we actually had a prototype of that gamified cognitive assessment that we could then use to start really get the ball rolling. And I wouldn't say that we're fully up and running just yet because we're still pre-revenue, but that just really goes to give you a sense on how long it takes to get some of these ideas, from the idea stage to the point where it's actually creating impact and helping people.
Awesome, thank you. We have a couple questions here. Let's see what the first one is. How are you going to deal with the affordability aspect of 8-bit Cortex?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. So from the very beginning, 8-bit Cortex was committed to a social enterprise model where we're going to make sure that there's at least a limited free version of our services available to everyone. And then we would have other forms of assessments and consulting as part of our business that would basically subsidize those costs, and that way it all balances out.
Oh, awesome, thank you. Another person is wondering, is research into the gut-brain axis being incorporated?
Not at the present moment, in the sense that we could give like general feedback on that. But I think the previous speaker mentioned that hardware is hard, and biological testing is also quite hard. So that would be quite a pivot in order to integrate that. Although that would be a dream of mine to be able to more comprehensively link all those different dietary factors with your mental health.
That would be really interesting. I can only imagine how difficult that would be, though. We've got another question here. What has been the most challenging part of your entrepreneurial journey?
I think honestly, you don't know what you don't know. And I feel like every month I'm learning something that I previously didn't know. So the hardest part is really just kind of feeling like you have a sense of everything that's going on and what the next steps need to be in order to hit your goals. Something that I was never taught in my science career, and I'm very grateful for the rest of the team at 8-bit Cortex really helping supplement that skill deficit of my own.
One more question here. Let me just scroll to it. Do you have ideas for other potential games to make assessments of stress, attention, etc.?
Yeah, so right now the other one that we've started to do a little bit of development on is try to gamify mindfulness meditations, where the length of the meditation and you incorporating a thought probe task would actually let you have a way to track how consistent your attention is and how frequently you mind wander, as a way to try to capture that as well. And then what I really like about that is we're simultaneously gamifying the assessment, but also providing the delivery of a service. As a lot of us are probably aware, mindfulness meditation has a lot of very general benefits for your brain. So I think being able to incorporate that particular game could be probably the lowest hanging fruit for us to really give back to the community while still acquiring that data.
Wonderful, thank you. And we've got 1 more minute here, so I'll just ask this one last question in chat. And it says, considering the shifting nature of research on psychological assessment, things like finding that the gut bacteria actually has an impact, what makes you say it's time to change some things?
Honestly, what I've thought was the catalysis for wanting to really make this project go forward was kind of the resistance within like the traditional clinical community. My original ideas is that incorporating, you know, EEG and neurotechnology into clinical assessment would be very straightforward because who wouldn't want more data? But when I started to realize some of the resistance from the neuropsychology community, that's what made me think that I needed an alternative route to create this impact. And that's when I was exposed to the entrepreneurship route as a way to, you know, create this commercializable service that could then kind of go from there.
All right. Thank you very much, Ty.
Thank you.
Quite enjoyed getting an in-depth understanding of your progress over your graduate studies. That was pretty cool to see.
Yeah, very nonlinear.
Yeah. I guess before I stop the screen share, I'm really looking forward to attending the Your Brain on Art. Just seems like such a cool event as far as combining visual art and brain research. It's pretty cutting edge.
Yeah, no, it should be pretty good. So with that said, I think you guys got the next